I'm thrilled to introduce today's guest. Arielle Nissenblatt is a true podcast marketing powerhouse. She's a producer, community manager, speaker, curator, and the founder of Earbuds Collective, a podcast curation and recommendation engine. Currently, she serves as the head of community and content at Squadcast.fm, helping to shape the future of remote podcast recording and collaboration. As a prominent voice on Twitter, she passionately shares insights, trends, and inspiration for podcast enthusiasts and creators alike. In this episode, we talk about Arielle's awesome podcast, Trailer Parks, a podcast focused on podcast trailers. We chat about the do's and don'ts of podcast trailers, and Arielle shares some very practical tips on how to approach creating a podcast trailer or beefing up an existing one. Enjoy. Hi, Arielle. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Let's do this.
Let's do this. So first, I want to start by saying that I'm a big fan of Trailer Park. I love how you manage to, strike the right balance between the educational aspect and the entertainment factor. I've learned a ton, listening to the podcast, listening to you and Tim, how you go about, analyzing those trailers. And I've, got some ideas on how I could improve my own trailer for this podcast. I'm also a fan of like the jingles and sound effects that are baked into the episodes. That just makes it so much more entertaining. And for people with a short attention span like myself, it's a great format.
Thank you. I'll just sit here and take that compliment.
So before we get into the do's and don'ts of podcast trailers, do you mind sharing with the audience, what was the idea, or how did you get the idea to make this podcast in the first place?
Yeah, I love all things about podcasts, and a big focus of mine is getting people to discover new shows, whether they are new to the concept of podcasts as entertainment or they've been listening forever and they're looking for something new to listen to. So last year around June, I decided that I would listen to the trailers for every single show that is listed in Apple Podcasts New and Noteworthy, and I would write about each one of those trailers. So for the month of June, I did that. And what was really fascinating to me was all of them were pretty entertaining. You have to have a certain caliber of quality in order to be listed on Apple's New and Noteworthy. Not every show, of course, is on par with every other show, but for the most part, they're being vetted by the wonderful people, the wonderful curation team at Apple. So I was entertained to a certain extent by a lot of these trailers. Some were not for me content-wise. But when I then went to listen to some of the shows, they didn't necessarily reflect what was being promised to me in the trailer or the tone of the show that was being promised to me in the trailer. So I found that really interesting. So all of this got me thinking about trailers, but not just about trailers, also about what it means for there to be a snippet of audio that is supposed to introduce a potential listener to a show. And how do you strike that balance? How do you make sure you are bringing people in and then delivering on the promise that you are sharing within the trailer or the teaser? So a few months later, I had the idea that there should be an entire show dedicated to podcast trailers. There should be a way for us to listen to just podcast trailers for shows that exist, trailers for shows that don't exist, never got made, or shows that were made just for fun. And it took a while for that eventually to come to fruition, but people were really excited by the idea. It was a tweet initially, and then I really built everything in public. I shared cover art in public. I shared a potential name in public, and I had people give feedback. I found Tim, my co-host, on Twitter. We are friends from the internet. And all of this came together, and you can sort of watch the progression on Twitter.
Awesome. And the production quality is really, really high. I've said it already, but I really, really love the show. Okay, can you tell us why is it important to have a podcast trailer if it's not obvious enough?
A number of reasons. I think it boils down to 3 reasons. The first is that it forces you as the creator of your show to distill down, to create an elevator pitch, to figure out the most important elements of your show and present those in a short period of time. It forces you to think about what is the most important. So you, as the creator, have to say, here is what I am going to say in 60 seconds, 90 seconds, hopefully not too much longer than that, about the show that might entice somebody to hit play on the rest of my episode. It makes you get choosy, and I think that's important. That's the first thing. The second thing is that in your podcast host, for most podcast hosts allow you to mark something as a trailer. You can usually mark something as a trailer, a regular episode, or a bonus episode. Some places might have other options for you. And then in most podcast listening apps like Apple and Spotify and Pocket Casts and CastBox and a few others, there's a dedicated marker that shows that that is a trailer, or that is a bonus episode, or that is a regular season episode. And in Apple and Spotify in particular, there are more, I'm sure, but those are the ones that come to my head first. There is a dedicated place for a listener to hit play on that trailer, to test you out, to decide if this 60-second, 90-second, 120-second trailer is exciting enough to them that they want to go and listen to the rest of your show. You're incentivized to make snippets of audio content that point people to your show by there being a place on a podcast listening app that people can just hit play, listen. If they like it, they continue. So those are two reasons. And then the third reason is that a trailer allows you to launch before you actually need to launch. So I usually recommend that your trailer should come out at least 2 weeks before your regular season. And the reason for that is because it allows you to populate your RSS feed. It allows you to say, look, our podcast is live. You can now search for it on these podcast listening apps, even if we're still in post-production for the rest of our episodes, even if we're still in production for some of our episodes. We do have a feed live, and with that feed live, you can start pitching to editorial places. You can start pitching to other podcasts to collaborate. You can start pitching to newsletters. You can start pitching to apps to potentially be featured in a new trailer section. Apple and Spotify are highlighting a lot of new trailers now, and you can then say, look, I have a new trailer.
So many benefits. We like to talk about conversion rate optimization at Voxelize, and taking some concepts from web and app store optimization. But when people get to your podcast page or general page, doesn't mean that they're going to start listening. So you want to increase your chances that press the play button. You've listened to dozens, if not hundreds, of trailers. Can you tell us what makes a great trailer? Can you give us practical tips on how to approach creating a trailer or beefing up an existing one?
Yeah, there are a number of ways to create a trailer, but in my mind, you could take one of two tacks, and you could take both tacks, and I'll tell a story about that in a moment. But the first is to do an in-universe trailer. So say you have an audio drama and you are thinking of creating a trailer for that audio drama. You could have your characters voice a trailer and really tease out what it might sound like if they press play on episode 1. Maybe you don't even mention that this is a trailer. Maybe you have it part of the canon of the show. So that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is, let's stay on the audio drama example, is to have maybe the producer of the audio drama come in and say, hello, I'm introducing this audio drama. It's dropping on this date at this time. Here's the name of the show. Here's what you can expect in this show. So those are two different ways that you can go about it. I think that you actually can do both. And I was talking to a colleague who said that he and his coworker disagree when it comes to making trailers, because he believes that you should do it the first way and she believes you should do it the second way. What do you think we should do? And I said, I think you should do both, and you should release them a week apart or a few days apart, and just give your potential listeners more insight as to how you made the show. And I think that as long as you have the budget, time, resources, whatever it is, these are short, you might be able to make both of those things happen and entice people to listen who might not listen otherwise, because one of those potential trailers turned a segment of the population off and the other one turned them on. So I think you could go about it in two ways. I think a successful trailer, in my opinion, says the name of the show, says what the show is about, says what I'm going to learn from that show, and tells me when it's dropping. I think that's very important. Tells me when I can expect the season.
So the first option is a bit like, I think, in the example you mentioned, on Trailer Park, which is like that kind of maybe cinematic option, with the deep voice, is like in a world like this. So, and the second option is having the producer announcing the show. What are maybe, nuggets of information that person should drop when recording the trailer to make it really enticing for potential listeners?
I think a lot of listeners want to know how they are going to be changed by the end of the episode that they're listening to. And that, I'm not saying there needs to be transformative change after every single episode of every single podcast, but what are you gaining from this episode? Or what are you being entertained by in this episode? Or who are you being introduced to in this episode or this season or whatever it is? So that is why I'm a big fan of sort of spoon feeding to people what they're going to get out of this. And I think for that reason, I am a big fan of trailers that tell you exactly what you're going to get. And people could disagree with me. And that's why I say you can also make a trailer that doesn't spoon feed people and it actually sort of teases things without necessarily giving everything away, which is why in-universe trailers make a lot of sense. They might give you the option to, as Newt Shottelcotty said in their trailer for Where the Stars Fell, which is featured on season 1 of Trailer Park, they said that it gave them an opportunity to showcase the really high audio quality and sound design of Where the Stars Fell. And I thought that was a really interesting way to approach showing off that trailer. My initial instinct would have been to say, Where the Stars Fell comes on May 4th, and it's going to be about X, Y, and Z, and here's a teaser, something like that, which you could do. You could do both, you could do either, you could do neither.
So when you do both, do you have the option to publish 2 trailer episodes when you put it in the settings of your hosting provider?
Yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Okay. Wasn't aware of that. How does that show then on the platforms on Spotify and Apple?
I think it chooses the most recent one. It depends. Yeah, it depends. You could also probably go into your settings on Spotify or on Apple and select one or be in contact with the support team. But I also think that you can consider making a trailer for every single season or every single series. You know, there are no rules, and you can play around with what you think makes the most sense for your listeners and for your producers and for the people on your team.
Got it. And so once you're well into, let's say, season 1, would you recommend maybe, going into your podcast analytics and looking at the completion rate of either of these options and maybe deleting one of the trailers so that, new listeners just go to the trailer that had the higher completion rate?
I think you could consider that. I think when your trailer is short anyway, yes, of course, you want people to listen to 100% of it. But it could be that they're just so damn excited to listen to the show and they've gotten out of the trailer what they want that they want to go to episode 1. So I do think that there's merit in having both. You're deleting downloads, so it's up to you. It also depends how small your show is, how big your show is. It might be worth asking your listeners what drew them to the show. I think you could experiment with deleting one. I think that's okay, but everything's okay, and I don't make the rules.
Yeah, what you just mentioned about, listening to a trailer, just wanting to go into the first episode of the show. That's how I felt after listening to the Serum trailer.
Hell yeah. A lot of people said that about that one.
It just pulled me in. It was so captivating, all the different voices and you're already, getting a glimpse of the intrigue, and it was really greatly made. Okay, so these were the do's of your trailer. Let's go to the don'ts now. I'm guessing the biggest mistake you can make is not having a trailer. What else is there?
I have heard a lot of trailers where people don't introduce themselves. I've heard a lot of trailers where people don't say the name of the podcast. I've heard a lot of trailers where people don't tell me when the show is coming. I have heard a lot of trailers with really terrible audio quality. I've heard a lot of trailers that don't match the tone of the actual show. So those are some things to think about.
Would you consider maybe in the description of the trailer episode putting a link to add the drop date to your calendar, or is it getting too geeky?
No, I would do that. That would be awesome. I mean, as much tracking as you can possibly do, that would be great. Who knows if somebody's going to click on that if they care that much, but hey, more power to you if they do.
Okay, so these are the biggest mistakes you've seen, in your consulting work and yourself as a podcast fan. Does anything come to mind?
I really think the biggest mistake you can make is making a trailer before you have most of your season ready, and then the trailer not being representative of that season. And maybe you leave out elements, or your writing for the trailer script was just not great writing and it didn't encapsulate what I'm going to get out of this season on the whole, but instead it's just the first 3 episodes. I think there is a way to make a trailer that does allow you to leave something open to the imagination. And there is also the option of waiting a little bit, making the trailer, and then publishing when you're ready. I think a big issue is that if you have an investigative podcast, for example, maybe you discover something in your 8th week of investigating and that negates the trailer that you've already created, or it makes something untrue, or whatever the situation may be. So I think it's worth waiting in order, and this goes the same for investigative shows, chat shows, whatever it is. Maybe you've discovered something new about your skills as an interviewer. and you want to redo the trailer so that it's more reflective of you and who you are at this time, I think it's worth it to do that. So that where we lose people in listening, speaking of analytics and conversion, is when something doesn't match the expectations. So the podcast cover art has to match the tone and style of the first 30 seconds of the trailer. The first 30 seconds of the trailer has to match the tone and style of the rest of the trailer, has to match the tone and style of your social media, has to match the tone and style of all of the things, so that you're not promising one thing and then delivering something else, because when that happens, you lose the trust of your audience.
So we've talked about making your podcast trailer too early. How about too late? Is there a point where it's too late for making a trailer? Let's say you're well into season 2. Is it still worth creating a podcast trailer?
I think it depends what you are trying to do. So for example, if you have a long season and it's ongoing and it's an investigative show, or if it's a chat show, or if it's whatever it is, you can always use a trailer to, number one, place that player on Apple or Spotify so that anybody at any time could be discovering your show and wanting to check out a trailer. So I think for that reason, it's worth it. But you could also submit your trailer. You could reach out to shows that are similar to your show and say, hey, would you consider playing the trailer for my season that is currently ongoing at the end of your next episode? And you can always do that. There's definitely value in people discovering your show at any time, depending on the content of your show. So I don't think it's too late. And I think a natural question that might pop up is, how is the trailer dropping on this random date throughout my show going to affect the flow of how it lays out in a podcast app? And I think that is a good concern to have. So I think something you could do is, telegraph that in the show notes. Hey, we're dropping a mid-season trailer because we've been advised that this is a good idea. You don't have to be that obvious about it, but you could say mid-season trailer. And then also maybe in your next episode, you could say, we dropped a trailer. It depends how transparent you are with your audience, and it depends how in-universe you like to be with your content, or if you like to have a direct, transparent relationship with the people that are listening to your show. I think it all really depends on who your listeners are, how you relate to those listeners, and ultimately what your goals are for the show. But I do not think it's a bad idea to drop a trailer when you are ready to drop a trailer. Of course, ideally, it should be at the beginning of the season, a few weeks before the season, but if you've got to, you've got to.
And just to make sure I got this right, from a technical standpoint, even if you're hosting, you mark your trailer as a trailer episode, it is still going to show in the natural order at which you publish the episodes, right? That's what you were saying.
It depends.
Okay.
Different podcast players will show different things.
Okay, so that's something definitely,
something to consider, yeah.
Taking into consideration. But I love your advice about making a trailer for maybe a feed drop or cross promotion. In that case, it's...
Yeah, you could always not publish it, but use it for cross promotion or for feed drops or for whatever collaboration you're interested in exploring. And you could also publish it as an audiogram on social, but not necessarily in your podcast feed. I think the challenge of distilling your content down into 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds is a great challenge to take on. Yeah,
and I really encourage the audience to check out Trailer Park and listen to some of these trailers and listen to your analysis and Tim's, because I think it's great to have all this advice distilled into this episode, but it's also good for them, I think, to hear the trailers, what they would improve, and then listen to your feedback and say, okay, that's how I should adapt this piece of advice to my own trailer. There was something I was curious about, which is on Trailer Park, you review trailer from shows that haven't been made. What are cases where a producer might make a trailer, but the show was not made or was not released?
We featured one of those types of trailers on season 1. It was for a podcast called Stuck on Sound. And I think the reason it was made was because it was a proof of concept. And if potential funders were interested in funding it, great. And if they were not, it wouldn't happen. So I believe that show is stuck in sort of an in-between state where the concept is great. It's a show about music and music discovery, but it's very hard to produce and it's expensive to produce. So there's a lot of barriers that are preventing that from happening. But another example is I've made several trailers for shows that have not been made, and it's because they were made along with a pitch deck, and if I got funding, I would have continued with a season, but did not get funding or am still in negotiation for funding. So things like that will happen all the time.
I think we're getting to the end of this episode. It's a short and sweet episode. Again, I really want to encourage the audience to check out Trailer Park. Just Google Trailer Park, the podcast Trailer Podcast. Otherwise, I'll drop all the links into the show notes. Where can our listeners follow you?
I am very available on the internet. If you just search for my name, which is Arielle Nissenblatt, and you'll find me.
You have a pretty big Twitter account, which I follow myself. I also advise listeners to follow. But yeah, okay. I'll drop all the links in the show notes, and then they can explore for themselves. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.